Getting into this discussion topic here on the respiratory system, you're going to learn that it's a lot more than just the lungs breathing in and out. Okay. I don't know who sings the song. Is it Stained? Breathe in, breathe out. You ever heard that song? All right. No, all right. So you guys are looking at me like I don't know, like I'm crazy. But there is a song in which there's the refrain is the guy says, breathe in, breathe out. And I can't remember who the artist was. Stained?
Oh, Stain.
Yeah, yeah. I think I'm pronouncing it correctly. I think it's Stain with a D, so Stained. No, yeah, not a lot of people know. But check it out. Real basic. Oh, and by the way, if you have your lab manual, when we go over the functions of the respiratory system, if you haven't done your pre-lab, it'll the pre-lab, because I'm going to be doing a pre-lab check today, which are the functions. There's 4 functions for the respiratory system listed in the lab manual. So when we go through that, jot it down, jot it down. All right, so basically, here is what we're looking at for the respiratory system. All right, it's an exchange process. So you're essentially going to be breathing air in, and you're going to be trading out carbon dioxide and oxygen. So essentially, we're going to be discussing all the events that essentially occur from when you breathe in respiratory gases, right, with inhalation, how those respiratory gases move across what we call the respiratory membrane in your lungs, how oxygen moves into the blood, how carbon dioxide moves out of the blood, and then as you're exhaling, carbon dioxide leaves the body, and then that oxygen that gets into your blood circulates around to the cells that need it for aerobic cellular respiration. So there's a lot more to it, but it's basically that simple. And you all learned way back when, all right, we need oxygen, all right, for aerobic cellular respiration, for ATP production. Where specifically? Nailed it. Powerhouse of the cell. Good job. Right? So we need that to have maximal ATP production. Right? It's essentially, right, one glucose molecule can yield us about 32 ATP. If we don't have oxygen, then we can only get 2 ATP from one glucose molecule. So you see the benefit in having oxygen. It's very, very helpful there. All right. So again, when we're discussing this whole respiratory system, we're going to be discussing what happens to our respiratory gases, right? Where they're exchanging, where they're coming to, where they're going to, right? So we'll be discussing everything pretty much from start to finish. So let's talk about the main organ that facilitates, right, this process, and that's going to be your lungs. So when I was younger, I used to think, how do my lungs stay inflated? Like how come they're not collapsing? Like what keeps them inflated? And we're going to discuss that process now. So hopefully some of you, if you've had that same question, it'll be answered here. So look at some of these terms here. Intrapleural pressure. What is the pleura? Y'all remember? Well, it's the actual serous membranes, right, that cover the lungs and the cavity that the lungs reside in. All right, so you have the visceral pleura, which lines the external surface of the lungs, and then you have the parietal pleura that lines the inside of the thoracic cavity or the pleural cavity where the lungs are going to be located. So when we discuss this intrapleural pressure, so intra is within, okay? So we're discussing the pressure in between the parietal pleura and the visceral pleura. So what you need to know for the intrapleural pressure is that it's low, which is good because that area in which we measure that intrapleural pressure is outside the lungs. If that pressure was high, what do you think could potentially happen to the lungs? No, they'd actually collapse. They'd be smushed down. But we're going to talk about overinflation here too, all right? Like a balloon, they can burst here. So keep in mind that the parietal pleura is attached to the inside lining of your thoracic cavity, right? Stuck on there. So when you take a breath, your chest expands side to side, front to back, top to bottom, but it expands outward. And as it does that, okay, those membranes there get pulled, right? And so as they pull outwards, they're going to pull the lungs with it, and they're going to help expand the lungs. And so they're going to change, all right? So we're going to talk about these pressures here, but they're going to help expand the lungs, and they're going to change pressures here. So if you recall way back when you first learned about the visceral and parietal pleura, that there is a space, a potential space in between those two layers there. And in most of those serous membrane, all right, layers there, in between those two layers, we're going to see, all right, normally a fluid in there, okay? Here, we're going to call it a serous fluid. And so if you've ever seen anything that has to do with water, water is a pretty sticky substance in regards to the molecular properties of water, right? So if you've ever heard of capillary action, which if you've ever looked at a beaker or a test tube that has water in it, you'll notice that it looks like here's your test tube. It's filled with water, and you'll notice that it looks like this, right? And so the water kind of clings to the edge there. That's what we're talking about here, right? And so your serous fluid is similar to that. It helps to kind of create a suctioning action there that creates a tension on these tissues here. So as you take a breath in, your chest expands, the lungs get pulled outward and they'll expand, right? And then of course, when you're exhaling, then everything recoils. Why? Because we have tons of elastic fibers in the elastic tissue of our lungs for that. It's like with your socks or underwear that have elastic in them. When you pull them and then release it, they'll snap back to their original shape. Same thing here with the lungs here. All right, so that's intrapleural pressure. Another pressure that we're going to talk about is what we call intrapulmonary pressure. So that's going to be the pressure in the lungs, specifically in the alveoli. Right? Now, here's the thing. The pressure in the lungs, the intrapulmonary pressure, should always be greater than the intrapleural pressure. Otherwise, collapse. Right? Otherwise, collapse. So we've dealt with pressure gradients before in chapter 19. We're going to deal with pressure gradients again in chapter 23. And so you all kind of understand that concept there, all right? So things are going to move down their pressure gradient. Blood move down its pressure gradient. We're going to see how air is going to move down its pressure gradient here with chapter 23. So there's going to be kind of like a slight comparison there between the two. But for right now, I want you to memorize, all right, intrapleural pressure should be low. Intrapulmonary pressure should always be greater than the intrapleural pressure. Right? And so that's how your lungs remain inflated. And if that changes, then the lungs can collapse. Okay, questions about that so far? So I'll show you a picture here of some of these membranes. So here you can see, as we zoom in and we look at the lining of your lungs here, you'll see you have the visceral pleura that's on the external surface of your lungs. And then you have your parietal pleura that are going to be lining the pleural cavity there. And in between that space there, you're going to have that filled with serous fluid. So it helps, all right, keep the lungs adhered to the the parietal pleura, but also in those two space. I'm talking too fast. I gotta slow down. I'm trying to rush the material. All right. In between those two layers, you have that space there, and that's where we're measuring our intrapleural pressure there. So this should always be low. If it becomes great, it will push the lungs inward and they can collapse. Okay. I really like this next slide here because this basically gives you, and the slide after this, because this slide here basically is talking about the main 4 parts or sections of respiration. Right, so the first one that you see up there, first of all, when you see respiration, keep in mind it is going to be an exchange of gases. But we're going to be talking about 2 areas. One, right, between the atmosphere, like the air in this room, and our lungs. And then the second place is going to be in our cells. So we're going to see gas exchange between the atmosphere, whether you're inside, outside, wherever, and your lungs, and then your blood and your tissues. So the 4 main categories we're going to be discussing are going to be pulmonary ventilation, alveolar gas exchange, gas transport, and then systemic gas exchange. All those places we'll be discussing. So when you think here pulmonary ventilation, think of the lungs and outside of your body. Go ahead. You look like you have a question. Yeah, yep. Alveolar gas exchange. So we're going to see the first gas exchange occur when you're breathing in. and exhaling. So the air in this room is entering into your lungs. Then the next area of gas exchange is going to occur between the alveoli and your respiratory capillaries there. So we're going to exchange gas between your alveoli and blood, and then we're going to transport that blood throughout the body, and that's going to be our gas transport. And then the last place is going to be the systemic gas exchange. So we bring those respiratory gases, oxygen obviously, to, all right, your cells, and we'll see another gas exchange between your blood and all your cells there. So those are going to be the four main points or discussion areas that we're going to have for respiration. So we're going to start off, and this next slide here basically explains, right, how we're going to transport gases throughout your body and back. So if you look at number one, all right, air containing oxygen is inhaled, and then it moves into your alveoli as you take a breath in. And then that oxygen moves from the alveoli into the pulmonary capillaries. And then those pulmonary capillaries are then going to move that oxygenated blood to where? Where does blood go from the lungs? First place. To the heart. Nailed it. Yeah, to the left side of the heart. So it goes to the heart, and then it gets pumped out through the left ventricle for systemic circulation. So blood goes to your systemic cells through the left side of the heart there. And then when it goes out to the cells, we're going to see another place of gas exchange. Oxygen is going to diffuse from your systemic cell capillaries into the cells. So that's the first half right there. So 1, 2, 3, 4 is the first half. The second half is now bringing stuff from the cells back to the lungs. So number 5 there, carbon dioxide, which is what? Waste. That's right. It is. It's the waste gas. So carbon dioxide, the waste from the cells gets booted into, all right, your systemic capillaries. So it's going to move from the cells into the systemic capillaries. And then it's going to get transported back to the lungs. It's going to go, right, into the heart on the right side of the heart. And then it's going to be, okay, pumped out through the right ventricle, right, into the pulmonary circulation. And the carbon dioxide then moves, all right, into the pulmonary capillaries once again. And then it is going to diffuse across that respiratory membrane into the alveoli. And then as you're exhaling, you're going to breathe that carbon dioxide off. So this is pretty much that whole breathing process there. So if you don't believe me, come back to that slide. There's a nice picture of basically what's going to go on. All right, so step 1, oxygen coming in. Step 2, oxygen moves from the alveoli into the pulmonary capillaries. Step 3, it gets dumped into your systemic circulation. Step 4, it's going to go from the systemic circulation into your cells. And then the cells got to pick up the trash. Okay, we dropped off the groceries. Now we're picking up the trash. And so now that's the first one. That's good. All right, not bad, not bad. yeah, I'm easing y'all in. All right. All right. So carbon dioxide then diffuses across the plasma membrane. It goes into your systemic capillaries, gets dumped into your systemic blood back to the heart, to the right side of the heart. Then it travels back to the lungs, and then carbon dioxide diffuses from the pulmonary capillaries into the alveoli. And as you exhale, carbon dioxide leaves the body. Pretty simple. Yeah, well, there's going to be more to it, but on a general overview, not bad, not bad. All right, so now we're going to get into, all right, the specifics of that first phase, step, stage, whatever you want to call it, of pulmonary ventilation here. So breathing, because that's essentially what we do. When we're breathing, right, we're moving these respiratory gases into and out of our lungs. So let's break it down, all right, and talk about the parts of ventilation or breathing here. Okay, so there's 2 parts to it, or 2 phases. Inhalation, which is what we call inspiration. And so that's going to bring air into our lungs. And then exhalation, which is expiration, which means we're going to move air out of our lungs. So every single one of us in this room is engaged in what we call eupnic or eupnea, normal, quiet breathing. Every single one of us. So this is what's going on here. We're just breathing regularly. Okay, so keep that in mind. It's at rest. And then obviously, if you're going to start to exercise or do anything extreme, all right, your respiratory rate increases. And then so shall your breathing rate, but also your force of breathing. What's wrong?
Now, you know, when you like think about breathing, when you start to manually breathe,
Yes.
you can't consciously take it back over, and you're like, "This is my life now."
I find it best to hold my breath. You're having a great, all right. As long as I didn't cause it. All right. So keep in mind, like most of the systems that we're talking about, the control center for a lot of these processes are going to be in the central nervous system, specifically in the brain stem. Right. And so normally in the brain stem, we have the three parts of the brain stem, okay, the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata, right? If you have to take a guess, where would you think that? Yeah, the medulla oblongata. But there is another breathing center in the pons, but you don't need that to live. Okay, it would just, your breathing would be really, really uncomfortable there. All right, so when you're breathing, you're going to be using certain tissues to help facilitate that. Primarily, it's going to be skeletal muscles. So what do we know about skeletal muscles? They are voluntary. You have, all right, the ability to control them relatively well when it comes to breathing, okay, until you pass out. And then you'll start breathing on your own, okay? So the whole purpose of our skeletal muscles is going to be to change the volume, which is the size of your thoracic cavity. Right, that's the purpose, because that's going to start to affect that pressure gradient that I mentioned before. All right, we're going to talk about some of these concepts here. Right, so if you change the volume, you will affect the pressure gradient. Okay, just know that right now. We're going to get into the specifics and how that happens. All right, whether you increase it or decrease it. So right now, just know you change the volume, you change the pressure gradient. Okay, and that's what you're going to essentially do when you take a breath in. You're going to change your thoracic cavity volume, and then we're going to affect the direction where air moves. Okay, whether it's moving in or out, which we'll talk about here in a second. All right, again, this is a very important concept. Air moves down its pressure gradient. We saw that, okay, when we were dealing with blood flow. Okay, so instead of dealing with a fluid now, we're going to just deal with a different phase of matter, all right, or state of matter, and we're going to deal now with gas. Okay, same concept though, same concept. All right, questions about that? So what do you think when you take a breath in, which direction is the air going? Is it leaving your lungs or coming into your lungs? Yeah, you take a breath in, so during inspiration, air enters in. When you're exhaling, it goes where? Perfect. I don't have to teach you that. You already know that, all right? So good. You know a good bit about some stuff here. So this slide here, and did you guys learn that with Dr. B, the muscles of respiration? Do y'all remember? Okay, that's fine. And normally I don't really teach it in 210 either, because I know I'm going to teach it in 211, right? But basically, when we're dealing with the muscles that are operating, all right, our current state of breathing, the two main muscles, well, the main muscle is going to be the diaphragm, all right, and then our external intercostals. So with quiet breathing, because essentially inspiration is an active process, expiration is a passive process. Okay, it's like when you contract a muscle, right, and versus when you relax a muscle. So when we're inspiring, when we're taking a breath in, the diaphragm and the external intercostals are going to contract. Now, essentially what happens with the diaphragm, when the diaphragm's at rest, it looks like this. It's like a big dome. And then when you take a breath, when it contracts, it flattens out. Right? And so that's going to change your thoracic cavity volume. And we'll talk about how it does that specifically in a few moments. When you're taking a breath in, your external intercostals, they'll contract. They're going to elevate the ribs outwards, like a bucket handle, and the bucket handles land against the bucket. This is the second analogy, all right? And then you go to pick it up. It moves out from the side there. So that's how, all right, your external intercostals will affect your ribs. It's going to elevate your ribs and it moves them outwards, okay? So again, we'll get into all these. So then, of course, when you're done taking a breath in and you start to exhale, you just relax everything. Totally passive process there, right? So think of relaxation, expiration, okay? Inspiration is going to be active muscle contraction. So that's for quiet breathing. Now, when we're doing forced inspiration, forced breathing, we're going to recruit some extra muscles. And you should know all of those muscles listed up there except for pectoralis minor. You didn't have to know that for 210. All right. SCM, sternocleidoid mastoid, that's that muscle, that V-shaped muscle that sits on the anterior lateral portion of your neck. Then you have the scalenes, the three scalenes, the anterior, middle, and posterior that sit on the side there. Pectoralis minor sits deep to your pectoralis major muscle. Okay, it attaches onto ribs 3, 4, and 5. All right, and so then it'll attach onto, I want to say the coracoid process. Don't quote me on that. All right, don't quote me. But point being is, and I should know that. And then you have the serratus posterior superior. Anyways, point being is you're going to recruit these extra muscles in order to get a larger change in your thoracic cavity volume here. So all of these sit superiorly on the thorax. So when you are going to utilize these muscles, they're going to pull the ribs up and out even more. So 3 ways that your thoracic cavity changes its dimensions, right, when we're affecting the volume. Okay, one is superiorly, which means we'll make it taller inside. The second is laterally. We'll make it kind of wider on the sides. And then finally, anteriorly, front to back. So those are the 3 directions when you take a breath, whether it's with normal breathing, eupneic breathing, or if it's with forced inspiration, okay? You're going to change the dimensions of your thoracic cavity in those 3, not 3 dimensions, those 3 directions, okay? Superiorly, inferiorly, right? And then laterally, and then anteriorly, front to back. And then you'll also see the erector spinae muscle group here. They'll also do the same thing in helping, right? But we primarily use the erector spinae muscles to do what? Yeah, literally helps to keep your back straight. All right, it's mainly a postural muscle here. So again, I won't spend too much time on this, all right? But if I talked about forced inspiration, I need to talk about forced expiration. All right, so these muscles here, internal intercostals, abdominal muscles, transversus thoracis, and serratus posterior inferior, right? These muscles will help to decrease the dimensions of your thoracic cavity. So when they're contracting, bless you, they're going to pull things down, they're going to pull things in, and they're going to pull things, all right, posteriorly means front to back, we'll shrink those dimensions down there. And so we call all these muscles the accessory muscles of breathing. And so certain respiratory conditions, for example, emphysema is a great one because those people have difficulty breathing. And so we need to utilize these accessory muscles more. So folks that have emphysema, right, will have they're referred to as having a barrel chest. And they'll also have well-defined neck musculature, the scalenes, the sternocleidoid mastoid. A lot of those muscles are well-developed because they're using them all the time. Like you all know what happens when you work your muscles out, hypertrophy, right? They get bigger and stronger. And so that's what will happen with these folks because they have to use them more often. So this picture here kind of shows you what we're talking about, all right, for the muscles for our inspiration, right? So you've got your scalenes, you've got your sternocleidoid mastoid muscle. There's the I got to not abbreviate the pectoralis minor muscle there. Right? And then you can see all of those will help to pull, all right, the ribs up and out, front and back, and increase the dimensions of the thoracic cavity, superior and inferior there. And then the muscles for forced expiration, you can see they're kind of below or more inferior, and they're going to pull everything back in and back down. All right. I don't want to spend too much time on that because I want to spend a lot of time on this, the mechanics of breathing. Right? So I told you guys, we saw on the previous, on a couple slides ago, that the volume, right, of your thoracic cavity is going to affect the pressure gradient. So we're going to first talk about what I mean by that is, okay? So when you take a breath in, your thoracic cavity's volume is going to change. Your ribs, when they elevate out, they'll get wider, okay? And then you'll also see from front to back, right? Your chest will expand front to back. And then when the diaphragm drops down, it's going to increase your thoracic cavity from the inferior and superior dimensions there. So let's start off with what we see vertically. Vertically is easy because the diaphragm. Here's your thoracic cavity with the diaphragm relaxed. All right, so if we measure it from top to bottom, not too bad. Now, when you take a breath in and the diaphragm flattens, see how we made it much bigger? See how this line here is longer than that line? That's what happens, right? Vertically, we change the dimensions of the thoracic cavity. We've increased our volume from this point to that point. So when it goes from the relaxed position to the contracted position, we now see, right, a larger dimension superiorly and inferiorly, or vertically, you could say. And so when you exhale, the diaphragm relaxes and it goes back to this position. All right. So let me kind of show you the three ways. I think there's a nice picture here that I'll throw in here. And we're talking about our thoracic cavity. All right. So think of your thoracic cavity, all right, like a box. So the first thing that you do, all right, when you take a breath in, the diaphragm contracts. So it becomes vertically increased. So the box is getting bigger in this direction. Then, at the same time as you're taking that breath in, your ribs are going to elevate, and when they elevate, they're going to move further laterally. So now you're widening the thoracic cavity. And then finally, when you take that breath in, right, your sternum, the inferior portion of your sternum, right, swings forward a little bit. So you're going to increase the distance from the posterior surface of the sternum back here towards the spine. So you're going to be changing all those dimensions so that that box in your chest gets bigger. More on what that means in a second. Then when you exhale and you relax, what happens to the diaphragm? The diaphragm goes back to its original dome position like that. So this distance here decreases, right? The external intercostals, when they relax, they drop the ribs back down to their original position. So essentially, we're no longer as wide, all right, from side to side. So that area narrows. And then finally, right, when everything relaxes, the inferior portion of the sternum moves back to its original position. So if you measure it from the posterior surface of the sternum back to the spine, there's less space in here. So essentially, we changed our box. So inspiration, the box gets bigger. Expiration, it gets smaller. That's the volume. And there's a reason why I'm mentioning this, okay? So this slide here talks about the two other changes there, the lateral dimensions there. Right, so rib cage elevation is going to widen the thoracic cavity when you take a breath in, and then during expiration, it narrows the cavity. And then anterior, posterior dimensions, okay, the sternum moves anteriorly when you inspire, which increases you from front to back. And then when you relax, it goes back to its original position, so there's less distance there. So do you all kind of see what I'm talking about? Even if you don't really quite understand exactly all the specifics that I just kind of went through, do you understand when you take a breath in, your chest expands, it gets bigger, and then when you exhale and you go back to that relaxed state, it gets smaller? Because that's going to lead us into this next concept called Boyle's Law. Guarantee you're going to see a test question on this, or 3 or more, I don't know. Right, I haven't made the test yet. All right, but keep in mind, this is a very important concept, this Boyle's Law. So let's kind of talk about it here. So I told you there was a relationship between volume and pressure. And so that's what Boyle's Law actually defines, that there's a relationship. And here's the nice thing about it, right? That with Boyle's Law, we're going to see another inverse relationship. So we're good with inverse relationships, right? We've seen a couple in 210 and 211, right? We saw one of our first inverse relationships when we were talking about hydrogen ion concentration in a solution and how it affects the pH value, right? So here's the next one. And you can kind of see here in the picture, right? When we have, right, an enclosed area, which you have an increase in the volume of that space there, but you see a decrease in the pressure. Now, if we're going to decrease the volume, so we kind of move that plunger down in that picture there. So we've decreased the volume, we notice, all right, an increase in pressure. And if you've ever done something like that with the plunger, you'll know what I mean, right? Because when you start to push it down there, you start to get some resistance because the pressure starts to build as you push that plunger down there, right? So if anything, memorize this concept that you have an inverse relationship between gas pressure and the volume of the space that it occupies. So if you increase the pressure, if you increase the volume, you decrease the pressure. And if you decrease the volume, you increase the pressure. And again, this is at constant temperature. And I will not give you a scenario in which the temperature is not constant, okay? So you don't have to really worry about that. But understand when we're talking about Boyle's law, that temperature has to be constant, okay? And it'll be assumed. All right, so this leads me into our pressure gradient situation here. This down here. So an air pressure gradient exists when force per unit area is greater in one place than another. We saw that in the heart, all right, when blood was moving from one chamber to the next. Right, we saw that there was a difference in the pressure, and so that the blood went from an area of high pressure to low pressure. Well, guess what? You're going to see the same thing here, all right, with air pressure. Air is going to go from an area of greater pressure to an area of low pressure. And so that's what you're seeing here. Now, this is showing you, all right, the first one there, area, hold on. Let me zoom in a little bit. Okay. So here you can see you have area A and area B. And this is showing you when both areas are equal, then the movement, there's not going to be any air movement, okay? Because they share the same volume, okay? If they share the same volume, that means that the gas pressure should be equal, okay? So no net movement of air. Now notice here in this large volume area and area B compared to area A, larger volume in area B, smaller volume in area A. But what do we know with Boyle's law? Right? Boyle's law says in an area with a large volume, what's the pressure like there? Inverse relationship, y'all. It's low pressure, right? High volume, low pressure. This one has a smaller volume, so it'll have a small volume but higher pressure. So the air pressure in area A is higher than the air pressure in area B. And so air is going to move from the high pressure area to the low pressure area. Okay, same thing over here. Now you'll see in the third example, you've got area A having a larger volume compared to area B. So area B has a smaller volume, therefore it's going to have a greater air pressure compared to area A because that has a larger volume, but it has a smaller air pressure. So where is the air going to go? It's going to go from a high pressure area, which is the smaller volume, to the low pressure region because it has a higher volume, okay? When in doubt, look at Boyle's law, inverse relationship between gas pressure and volume. And so keep in mind, just like we learned with pressure gradients, with fluid movement, we're going to follow the same concept. Because here's what we're going to do. When you're breathing, you're changing the volume of your thoracic cavity. So are we not changing those pressure gradients inside of our chest? Right? That's how air movement occurs during the breathing process. I'll get into the specifics here. All right. So before I get into the specifics of breathing, we got to take into account a couple of terms here, right? We got to talk about pressure areas and then some volume areas. Oh, I forgot I have coffee. Guess what kind of creamer I have in here? French vanilla. You guessed it. Does that make me less manly? It's okay.
But when, yeah. Wait, don't you want to?
I'll have to try that. I'm just not doing I'm just not doing pumpkin spice. I'm not a communist. Okay, so here we go. Ain't nothing wrong with that. No, you just have to have the right toppings. Black olives, banana peppers, regular peppers, no onions because I have to see patients, so you don't mess around with the onions. Arugula, romaine lettuce, feta cheese, or as my mother-in-law calls it, feta. All right. And she's straight up New York, so I don't know why she tries to put on like a Greek Italian accent.
Black olives, feta. You're okay with black olives and feta and seeing patients.
Yeah, yeah. And I'm trying to think what else I put on there. I used to do craisins. Oh yeah, and grape tomatoes. Grape tomatoes. Yeah. It's good. I'm telling you. You don't have to put dressing. I will if I have some. Yeah, no, it's true. It's true. It's true. I got to put some in there. You know what's really good is the Chick-fil-A Southwest salad with the avocado lime ranch dressing. Even though I think people that eat ranch are a little bit nuts, but I'm a blue cheese guy, but I'll do it. I'm sorry. All right, here we go. Let's get back on track. All right. Yeah. I'm from New York. Yeah, it is a Yankee thing. Straight up Yankee. Speaking of which, Friday night, tomorrow night, Yankees in the World Series are going to beat the bottoms off of the Dodgers. All right. So volumes and pressures. We're going to start to focus on how these things affect our breathing. So the first pressure that we're going to look at is atmospheric pressure. So what is that? That's the pressure of the air in this room. Or when you're outside by your car, that's the pressure of the air outside. Okay, it's the air pressure outside of your body, essentially. All right, so, and that changes with altitude, right? You guys have heard the term, like when you're up in the mountains, the air is thinner, that sort of thing, and versus when you're at sea level. So you need to know these numbers here. Actually, there's only one number that I want you to know right now. That's this one. 760 millimeters of mercury. That is the air pressure at sea level. Now, obviously, as you start to move up in altitude, you know, that number becomes less and less, right? But you need to know that. If you want to learn 14.7 pounds per square inch, whatever. But 760 millimeters of mercury is what we refer to as 1 atmospheric unit. Right? So pretty much for the purposes of this class, right, this number will not change at any time when you're breathing. So the pressure in this room or when you're outside, all right, for any questions or scenarios that I'm going to throw at you, right, is always going to be 760 millimeters of mercury. That's not going to change, right? So keep that in mind. Now, alveolar, again, volume. So we're going to be talking about, all right, space, all right, area and whatnot. So that is, when we're talking about alveolar volume, we're talking about the volume of all the alveoli in your lungs. Okay. Then our next units that we're going to talk, term we're going to talk about is the intrapulmonary pressure. This is the pressure inside of your lungs, specifically in the alveoli. Now, this number will change. Okay, so there's 3 ways that number is going to change. It's either going to be higher than the atmospheric pressure in this room, lower than the atmospheric pressure in this room, or the same. I'm not even going to give you, the only value I'm going to give you, well, I'll give you some values, but you don't have to memorize them. I just want you to know those 3 scenarios. So your lung pressure, the intrapulmonary pressure, is the one that's going to change when you are breathing. So again, one more time. It's either going to be higher than the air pressure in the room, so it's going to be higher than 760 millimeters of mercury. It could be 761, 762, okay? It can be lower, so it could be 759, 758, or it's going to be the same, okay? Those are your three possibilities here. So when it's 760, when it's equal, right, to the atmospheric pressure, when the pressure in your lungs is the same as the air pressure in the room, right? That's only going to occur at the end of you taking a breath in and at the end of you exhaling. And I'll show you the examples here. There's one more pressure term that I want you to know because we're forgetting one other place. and that's the intrapleural pressure, the pressure in the pleural cavity there. This too is going to change. But what did I say before, way back at the beginning of class today? It should be low. It should be always lower than your intrapulmonary pressure. Intrapulmonary pressure has always got to be greater than the intrapleural pressure. If that relationship flip-flops, we're getting lungs collapsed. All right. So keep that in mind. Lower than our intrapulmonary pressure. All right. And roughly, if you want a value, about 4 millimeters. But that's not important. I mean, the values to me is not important. All right. It's important that you should know that. Right. But I'm not so stuck on certain numbers other than 760. Okay. So look here. This statement here speaks, no pun intended, volumes of what you need to know. I didn't mean that. Okay. So literally, okay, we understand Boyle's law, hopefully, the inverse relationship between volume and pressure. So this statement here says volume changes create pressure changes and air flows down its pressure gradient. Okay, we need to change that pressure gradient so we can direct the movement of where air is going to go. Right? So when you want air to enter into your lungs, so when you're taking a breath in, where do you want the pressure in your lungs to be greater than the pressure in the room during inspiration? Right. I see some of you shaking your head. No, you don't want that. Because remember, air is going to move down its pressure gradient. So if the air pressure in this room is greater than the air pressure inside of our lungs, where's it going to go? Into your lungs. So how do we do that? How do we get air to flow into our lungs? We increase the volume of our lungs. How do we do that? Take a breath in. That's what I spent the last 10 minutes talking about with y'all. Yeah. So when you take that breath in, okay, the diaphragm drops down, the ribs elevate and expand, and then the sternum swings forward. So we increase our box. So we increase our thoracic cavity box. We decrease the pressure. And when the pressure is greater in this room than in our lungs, air flows in. You guys cool with that? Okay. So then to conversely talk about expiration, we're just going to reverse all that. We're going to shrink our box. We're going to make it smaller. So when you're exhaling, everything goes back to its original positioning. Our thoracic volume decreases. Therefore, Boyle's law, what does that mean? What happens to the pressure? It increases. And it increases more than the pressure in this room. So what's the air pressure in this room? 760. So that means that we need to increase the air pressure in our lungs to 761 or greater. And when we do that, air moves out of the lungs. We'll talk. Do you guys kind of see that? All right. I know I'm moving slow and I'm not moving along as fast as I'd like to, but that's okay. That's why you got videos to watch. He said it. I know, Christian. Real quick. All right. So this picture here is kind of displaying to us, right, what's happening just as you finished exhaling. You haven't taken a breath in yet. You've just relaxed everything. Okay. Your diaphragm has kind of gone back to its dome configuration. Your lungs have settled back in. Right. And so this person has just finished breathing. So you're seeing now, okay, what did I say? The pressure in your lungs is going to be equal to the atmospheric pressure at 2 points during your breathing cycle. Okay. One at the end of inspiration and at the end of expiration. Okay. So that's what we're seeing here. Okay. The intrapulmonary pressure is 760. The atmospheric pressure is 760. So there's not going to be any net movement of air. Right. And always keep in mind the intrapleural pressure is always going to be smaller than this number here. So we're about 4 millimeters less. Right. So that's good. Everything's good. The lungs are inflated. We're ready to go. We're going to take a breath here. So now we're going to go through, the specific steps here for taking a breath in. And we're going to talk about what all happens. Oh, I didn't. Oh, come on now. There we go. All right. So here's what we're going to see, right? Just to remind you, pressure in your lungs, the intrapulmonary pressure and the atmospheric pressure are 760 millimeters of mercury. Intrapleural pressure is 4 millimeters less than the intrapulmonary pressure. All right, now we're going to take our breath. So what do? Our diaphragm contracts, it flattens out. Okay, the external intercostals elevate the ribs, so they move up and out. So we just increased, right, the thoracic volume. So we've made our box bigger. Right, so when this happens, when we've made our box bigger, the intrapulmonary volume increases. So what happens if we increase the intrapulmonary pressure, the intrapleural pressure? If that volume increases, what happens to the pressure? It's up there on the board. It decreases. All right. So intrapulmonary or intrapleural volume increases. So that means that the intrapleural pressure decreases, and so does the intrapulmonary pressure. So now what's going to happen is the intrapulmonary pressure is going to become less than 760 millimeters of mercury. So when it becomes less than the atmospheric pressure, right, we've created a pressure gradient, and air is going to flow into our lungs. And usually it's going to be about 500 milliliters. And we have a name for that, which is called the tidal volume. So that's roughly about the amount of air when you take a breath in. It's going to be about 500 milliliters of air. And then when you exhale, it'll be the same. It'll be another 500 milliliters. Right? So pretty nice. It's an easy number to remember. So tidal volume is the amount of air that is going to move, all right, out of you and into you when you take a breath. Not at the same time, though. Okay, what I mean is when you inhale, you're going to take in 500 milliliters. When you exhale, you're going to exhale 500 milliliters. Everything. Yeah, and we're actually going to see, because I mean, I'm sure most of you know that that oxygen is not the most abundant gas in our atmosphere. Does anyone happen to know what it is? Nitrogen. Yeah. Nitrogen's the most abundant. Then I think there's like argon. There's a whole bunch of stuff in there. Okay, so that's going to be, all right, inspiration. Well, guess what? Expiration is pretty easy to learn too, because now what are we going to do? We're going to relax everything. So here's what happens. The diaphragm goes back to its dome-like position here, and the external intercostals relax and they lower the ribs back down here. So initially when we start, because like I said, the only times that the intrapulmonary pressure and the atmospheric pressure are ever equal is going to be at the end of inspiration and at the end of expiration. Okay, so as they relax, our box gets smaller. So as our box gets smaller, what does that mean? The volume decreases in your thoracic cavity. Therefore, what does that do to the pressure inside the thoracic cavity? It increases it, right? Boyle's law. So pleural cavity volume decreases. That means the pressures are going to increase here. What helps with that a lot? All that elastic tissue that you learned about in chapter 5. Everything springs back to its original positioning there. And so since the pressure inside of your lungs becomes greater than the air pressure in the atmosphere, in your room, in your car, wherever, then air flows from your lungs out of your mouth into the atmosphere. And again, we're going to see our tidal volume of 500 milliliters. All right, so what goes up must come down, what goes in must come out, sort of thing. All right, and at the end of that expiration process, that's again where we're going to see, all right, intrapulmonary pressure will be equal to the atmospheric pressure. The only times that they're going to be equal. Which makes sense, right? If the pressures are equal, we're not going to see any air moving in or out. Okay? All right, so this is picture here. We'll kind of show you. Again, it'll walk you through the steps. If you're not sure, if you want to actually look at I'm not going to go over this because I just did, but you can walk through these steps here and kind of see. This is what, figure 23.22a. So something just to kind of take a peek if you want to understand. And again, here's the box. The boxes are changing. Big box, little box, right? So inspiration, thoracic cavity box is big, which means the pressure is low inside of the lungs. It's greater outside, and so air flows in. And then expiration, your thoracic cavity box gets small, which means the pressure increases, and that increased pressure is greater than the atmospheric pressure, so then air flows out. Cool? Go over it a couple times, read this, memorize it, learn it, all right? You guys will understand that. This picture here is just showing you airflow here with volume, all right, and time. So one complete breath, which includes inspiration and expiration. All right, breath in, breath out. So that's what we're seeing. You can see, look, the volume of what's moving, okay, as you inspire, 500 milliliters. And then as you exhale or expire, then same amount going in and out. And then down here on the lower graph here, you'll see how the pressures, right, are moving as airflow is occurring. Right, so both here with intrapulmonary and intrapleural, you'll see they both kind of decrease, right? And then how they'll both kind of increase there during expiration. All right, that brings me here to the mechanics of breathing, all right? And when we're talking about, we understand the mechanics of eupneic breathing, normal quiet breathing, right? But when you're exercising, we talked about those muscles that we utilize, right, for our forced breathing, okay? I won't list them all off, but you kind of remember some of them or all of them, hopefully. All right, but we're going to start to recruit those muscles because they're going to help change the thoracic cavity volume even more than our normal quiet breathing. So we have to even increase that thoracic cavity volume even more. And when we do that, the pressure gradient becomes that much larger and airflow becomes that much more. So if you increase the pressure gradient, then you are going to change airflow. That sounds familiar. Doesn't that sound familiar? Didn't we see a concept like that before? You know where I'm going with this. Blood flow. Remember when we changed the pressure gradient? Remember, flow is equal to delta P divided by resistance. Okay, so if you change your pressure gradient for airflow, then we're going to change the pressure gradient for airflow. You're going to change the amount of air that moves in and out of the lungs there. So that's what we're talking about here. All right, so increase the pressure gradient by increasing the thoracic volume changes, then you're going to increase airflow movement. Another reason why we do the circulatory system chapter before we do this chapter, teach you that concept. All right. I'm excited today. I haven't really told you guys why, or maybe I did tell you why. I'm getting my new baby today, my new fur baby. She's coming. I got a picture. I'll show you. I can't get the stupid Elmo to work, so I'm gonna show you guys in the lab. She's so beautiful. All right. My wife is en route to pick her up right now. Yeesh. So that means for the rest of the semester, I'm going to be horribly exhausted. All right, more so than I am now. So if you think I'm going to be drinking about 2 of these, this is, oh yeah. I don't sleep much.
Gotcha.
Yeah. I don't sleep much. Yeah. All right, so let's talk about, oh good, we got time. All right, moving along at a better pace. Okay, so of course, talking about these systems, we got to talk about the control center. What controls these systems here? So we're going to discuss the nervous system, how it affects, all right, or exerts its control over your breathing. So of course, right, we have our respiratory center in the brainstem, and they're in 2 places, in the medulla oblongata and in the pons. Right? So of course, right, how we regulate a lot of functions when we're dealing with these systems that we've been talking about this semester is through autonomic nerve reflexes. And so, of course, with any autonomic reflex, we're going to have to deal with the autonomic nuclei. What's the nuclei? I just taught this to my 210 class. You remember what nuclei are? Not in the cells, but Yep, I heard it. Yeah, it's a cluster of cell bodies in the central nervous system. A cluster of cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system is called a close ganglia. Yeah, a tract is going to be a bundle of parallel axons in the central nervous system. We call that a nerve in the peripheral nervous system. I know it's all coming back to y'all. It's all coming back. Okay. So anyways, in those two regions of the brainstem, in the medulla and in the pons, right? In the medulla, you're going to have two groups. One's called the ventral respiratory group. The other one's called the dorsal. One's in front, one's in back, right? And so those are going to be the main players in respiration. When we're discussing force of respiration and breathing rate, they're going to play a big role. All right, the pons here, or the pontine respiratory center, also known as the pneumotaxic center, this center here just makes our breathing more fluid. Okay, it's pretty much effortless for us during eupneic breathing to breathe in and to breathe out. If you damage the pons, right, your breathing is like, it's much more ratcheted. So it kind of be like, as I'm taking a breath in, I'll be like, all right. So again, pons just kind of helps with that nice transition between inspiration and expiration. All right. Do we need it to live? We need it to live comfortably, right? But no, do we? Yeah. So, but we need the medullary respiratory center. You need that to live. Okay. So these, all right, neurons, these nerves are going to affect the muscles that are going to change the volume of the thoracic cavity here. So for the ventral respiratory group, they're going to synapse. Now, again, this is going back to chapter 15, right? Remember the autonomic nervous system. So we learned back in 210 that you have an upper motor neuron and a lower motor neuron. And lower motor neurons are that neuron that exit from the spinal cord, usually out of the anterior horn, out to the skeletal muscle. So what we're going to see here is the neurons for the medullary respiratory center, specifically the ventral respiratory group, they're going to directly synapse onto the lower motor neurons of your skeletal muscle. They kind of hijack it, so to speak, right? So they're going to stimulate those lower motor neurons to stimulate the contraction of the diaphragm, of the external intercostals there, right? So again, they're kind of hijacking and jumping on board part of our voluntary or somatic nervous system here, but we're allowed to do that. We can cross over. We're allowed. That's definitely what's going to happen. So they go out to the respiratory muscles here. So they're going to travel, right, in a couple of our different types of nerves. Y'all remember the phrenic nerve, right? That was that nerve that sat on the anterior scalene, right? You might not remember it, but the phrenic nerve directly innervates your diaphragm. So hiccups usually are a result of some sort of pathology that's temporarily affecting the phrenic nerve. And so a good way, what's a good way to cure somebody of hiccups? Like drink water, put a bag over their head. Yeah, stuff like that. Oh no, wait, it's pop the bag, not put the bag over their head. You don't want to put the bag. Hey, listen, don't put the bag over anybody's head, right? Don't punch them in the neck either. Point being is, all right, those nerves for the phrenic nerves innervate the diaphragm. Intercostal nerves, were just otherwise known as anterior rami. Those are going to innervate your intercostal muscles, the external intercostals. Again, that's a little bit of a review for you. All right. So that's for our ventral respiratory group here, how we're able to effectuate the breathing. So let's talk about our reflex, because that's kind of what we're going to be dealing with. So to start off, we need to talk about, you guessed it, the receptors, right? And so, of course, we're going to be dealing with chemoreceptors. And notice, this is very important. So I'm going to kind of slow down here. We'll probably finish up with this tonight, right? So chemoreceptors, as we know, monitor the chemical composition of a solution. And so that solution in this situation is going to be, we're going to talk about this, cerebral spinal fluid is going to be one of those solutions that can effectuate, all right, our nervous system control of breathing. And also we'll discuss your blood composition. But it's based on three things. Hydrogen ions. So you know what that means immediately, right? When we talk about hydrogen ion concentration, what are you thinking? Yes, right. You're thinking pH. Yep. Which has to do with acidity and alkalinity. So that's what you should be thinking. pH and then what we call PCO2 and PO, which stands for the partial pressure of carbon dioxide and the partial pressure of oxygen. Point being is, we're going to be looking at those three things: hydrogen ion concentration, how much carbon dioxide you have in a solution, and how much oxygen are in a solution there. So we have two types of chemoreceptors, and they're aptly named. The central chemoreceptors are located in the central nervous system. And so what kind of fluid is in the central nervous system? Cerebral spinal fluid. So those central chemoreceptors are going to be monitoring primarily the pH of your cerebral spinal fluid there. And then obviously the other type is the peripheral chemoreceptors. And so they're going to be monitoring the stuff that's out in the periphery, our blood, but specifically the blood that passes by the aorta and in your carotid arteries there. I'll get more into specifics there, right? So central is going to be CSF. Peripheral is going to be blood in the carotid bodies and in the aorta. So back to the central. So any change in the pH value, right? These things will pick it up. If the pH drops, things become more acidic. If the pH increases, things become more basic or alkaline here. And so usually what is going to cause a change in the pH is going to be this guy, carbon dioxide. And we haven't learned this yet, okay? We haven't learned, all right, what carbon dioxide and how it affects pH values. We'll talk about it. I'm not going to talk about it tonight, but I want you to understand there's a certain chemical process that occurs, all right, that involves carbon dioxide that can alter and affect the pH of your blood or of your cerebral spinal fluid. Well, like I said, we'll talk about it later on, but it involves this enzyme here called carbonic anhydrase. And what happens is carbonic anhydrase is going to create carbonic acid, and it only needs these two ingredients, carbon dioxide and water. So if your carbon dioxide levels increase, we always have water on hand, all right? If your carbon dioxide levels increase, carbonic anhydrase can undergo this chemical reaction in which it needs carbon dioxide and water, and it's going to make carbonic acid, which is going to do what to the pH of a solution? It's going to decrease it. So we're going to get a change in the pH value there. And so these chemoreceptors there will see that. So it's going to say, all right, I've got to figure out a way to decrease my carbon dioxide levels, which we'll talk about here sometime in this chapter, right? But not tonight, all right? But for right now, just understand the ingredients that we're dealing with. Carbon dioxide and water. But since we're talking about the respiratory system, we're going to be focusing on carbon dioxide and what is going to influence carbon dioxide? Breathing, right? Okay? So whether or not you're able to breathe off enough carbon dioxide to get rid of it so those carbon dioxide levels decrease. More on that. I'm getting off on a tangent. I apologize. Let me stay on the slide here. Then we've got our peripheral chemoreceptors. And so they're going to monitor the amount or the concentration of our hydrogen ions that are floating around in your blood and your carbon dioxide and oxygen levels here. Right? So here again, we're going to see, right, basically these three things, hydrogen ions, carbon dioxide, and oxygen. And all of those three things are going to be the stimuli that will stimulate the chemoreceptors, all right, to effectuate some sort of response, whether it's an increase in breathing or a decrease in breathing, which we'll talk about. I know I keep saying this later, right? So carotid chemoreceptors are going to utilize, and you already kind of know this from chapter 19, the glossopharyngeal nerve, and then the aortic chemoreceptors are going to be sending messages on the vagus nerve here. So if we increase our hydrogen ion concentration, we make a solution more acidic. And so we've got to figure out a way to get rid of that. And that gets into buffering and all that, which we will discuss, right? Trust me, I just want you for right now, because I don't want to throw too much at you. For right now, I want you to just understand, right? Hydrogen ion concentration, carbon dioxide concentration, and oxygen concentration play very important roles, all right? The levels, right, play very important roles on how your respiratory system is going to compensate, right? And again, we learned what happens if if your blood becomes too acidic. Well, yeah, that can happen, but you can start to get protein denaturation. So now enzymes start to become useless, and a lot of physiological processes become very difficult to achieve. And yeah, of course, it can ultimately result in death, and a lot of other bad things can happen there. All right. Last one right here. Okay. A couple other receptors that we're going to talk about. Irritant receptors, which are going to be affecting pretty much almost everybody in this room around this time of year, right? Especially when pollen levels increase, right? So when you breathe in, right, certain particulate matter, if you live in a city where there's usually a lot more pollution, right? But at the time, we've all done it. When you breathe something in and you start to sneeze, well, that's because the irritant receptors have been stimulated by whatever it is that you inhaled there, right? Baroreceptors, stretch receptors. Where are we going to have those located? In your serous membranes that cover your lungs in the thoracic cavity, and then in your bronchioles. And then finally, who would have thought proprioceptors, right? You remember those receptors, also known as mechanoreceptors, that are located around your joints, right? In the muscles and the joint capsules there, right? And so when your body is moving, those receptors are stimulated. So think about it. Is your body moving a lot right now? Not too much though, right? Okay. So your proprioception is, those receptors are not going to be as stimulated. But when you start to run, when you're doing vigorous activities like rock climbing and falling, but when you're doing vigorous activity, right, your proprioceptors are are firing more. And so again, that's because there's usually an increase in activity. So those receptors will help regulate or contribute to breathing patterns there. All right, perfect. This is actually a good place to stop. So let's stop here.